They say that when you get old, the first thing to go is the memory of pain. You forget how the cold bit into your bones, or how a bruise turned yellow and green. But I don't believe that. I remember the noise. Even now, sitting in this quiet room with the clock ticking on the wall, I can hear the Krupp works in Essen. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical weight, a rhythmic, crushing hammer that beat the air out of your lungs. It was the heartbeat of a monster we were feeding, shift after 12-hour shift. I suppose I should tell you who I was before the world went mad. But the man I was in 1933 feels like a stranger, a ghost who wore my face but didn't have my scars. I was a fitter, a union man. We believed in the dignity of labor, in the solidarity of the shop floor. Back then, a machine was something you respected because you understood it. You listened to the hum of a lathe or the chug of a press, and you knew if it was sick or healthy. You coaxed it. No, now in 43, we didn't coax machines. We flogged them. We drove them until the bearings screamed and the metal fatigued, churning out parts for the Panther tanks that were rolling east to die in the snow. I remember the smell most of all. Not the smell of death that came later, but the smell of the factory. Ozone sharp and metallic, tasting like a battery on your tongue. The heavy, sweet stench of cutting oil that clung to your skin, so tight no amount of lye soap could scrub it off. It was the smell of the Reich. I was working the transmission assembly line. It was intricate work, requiring steady hands, which was a joke because by 1943, everyone's hands shook. Whether from hunger or the schnapps we drank to forget the hunger, or just the terror that sat on our chests like a fat toad, we all shook. I had a leaflet in my left hand, a small, square piece of paper, folded until it was no bigger than a stamp. It was burning a hole in my palm. Schmidt, the voice cut through the din of the drop hammers. I didn't jump. You learn not to jump. Jumping is guilt. I turned slowly, wiping my greasy hands on my overalls, palming the paper deeper into the fabric. It was the foreman. I think his name was Weber, or maybe Wagner. My memory blurs the faces of the little tyrants. Let's call him Weber. He wore his party pin like a medal, right on the lapel of his clean jacket, unspotted by oil. This line is slowing down. Weber barked. He had to shout to be heard, but his eyes were quiet, scanning my face, looking for a crack. Production quotas are down 3% since lunch. Sabotage, he threw the word out casually, like he was asking about the weather. But in Essen in 1943, that word was a death sentence. It meant the Gestapo cellar. It meant disappearances. The planetary gear housing is warped, I said, my voice flat. I tapped the casing with a wrench. The casting is poor. I have to file it down manually to get the bearings to seat. If I force it, the transmission will seize up before the tank gets off the train. It was the truth, but it was also a lie. The casting was poor. Everything was poor quality these days, but I had been filing the same millimeter of steel for 20 minutes. Stalling, it was my own small rebellion. A micro-sabotage. Weber lined in. I could smell the sausage and coffee on his breath, luxuries I hadn't tasted in months. He looked at the gear, then at me. For a second, I thought he knew. I thought he could see the leaflet through my skin, the paper that screamed about the lies of Stalingrad, about the murder of the Jews, about the madness of the Fuhrer. My heart was hammering against my ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage, but I kept my face slack, bored. The face of a dumb ox who only knew how to turn a wrench. Make it fit, Weber spat, straightening up. The Reich needs tanks, not excuses. You have 10 minutes to catch up. He walked away. I didn't exhale until he was 3 bays down. I looked at the machine in front of me. A beautiful piece of engineering, perverted for murder. I hated it. I hated myself for being good at fixing it. That night, after the whistle blew and the shift shuffled out like a herd of gray cattle, I didn't go home to my empty apartment. I went to the old boiler room in the basement of the workers' housing block. It was damp, smelling of mold and wet coal. There were 3 of us. Just 3. We called ourselves the Rot Funken, the Red Sparks. A grand name for 3 terrified men huddling in the dark. Fritz was there. He was older. a communist from the old days who had somehow survived the purges. He looked like a dried apple, all wrinkles and toughness. He placed a bundle on the crate between us. "New batch," Fritz whispered, "from the printer in Bochum. They need to go out tonight." I looked at the bundle. Leaflets, hundreds of them. Paper bullets. "Inside the factory?" I asked. My voice sounded thin. "The night shift is skeleton crew," Fritz said. "Security is lax on the East Wing. We need to remind them, Hans. We need to remind the workers that Germany is not just. That we are still here." He pushed the bundle toward me. I looked at his hands, gnarled, stained with ink. Then I looked at my own hands. Gray-stained, maker's hands. I thought of Weber. I thought of the warped gear housing. I thought of my Jewish neighbors, the Goldsteins, who had been taken away 2 years ago. I had watched from behind my curtains. I had done nothing. "Are you with us, Johann?" Fritz asked. The silence in the boiler room was heavier than the noise of the factory. If I took this bundle, I was crossing a line. Filing a gear slowly was one thing. Spreading treason in a war plant was another. It was suicide. But then I remembered the feeling of the file against the steel. The resistance. The friction. I reached out and took the paper. It felt heavy. Heavier than steel. Clank ladder skidder. Thumb, 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 3, 2, 1. Jehim Kommandassach. Jehim Kommandassach. If I left this here, I was an accomplice. Every tank that refueled because of these plans would be my fault. Every bullet fired by a revitalized division would be on my conscience. Silence was no longer survival. Silence was murder. Clang, clang. The boots were on our floor. I could hear the jingle of equipment belts, the low murmur of voices. They weren't just patrolling. They were searching. A beam of light cut through the frosted glass of the partition wall, sweeping across the rows of drafting tables like a lighthouse searching for a shipwreck. It hit the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into swirling galaxies of gray. I was frozen. My lungs had turned to stone. The light swept closer to the supervisor's office. It washed over the desk, inches from my hand. Then, the sound that stops your heart. The scratch of metal on metal. A key sliding into the lock of the office door. The tumbler clicked. The handle began to turn. I didn't think. Instinct took the wheel. The same instinct that makes you pull your hand back from a hot lathe before you even feel the heat. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a machine reacting to a critical failure. I snatched the blueprint. I rolled it tight, crushing it, shoving it inside my coveralls against the sweat-soaked wool of my shirt. It felt huge, sharp, jagged against my skin. "The hatch," I hissed at Peter. The door swung open. The beam of the flashlight stabbed into the room. But we were already gone. We hadn't run out the door. We had gone down, under the supervisor's heavy oak desk. Beneath the Persian rug he kept to separate himself from the factory floor was a maintenance access panel. I had serviced the heating ducts 3 years ago. I knew it was there. We had slid the rug, pried the panel, and dropped into the black throat of the factory just as the heavy boots stepped onto the floorboards above our heads. I pulled the panel back into place, leaving only a sliver of light before the rug settled over it. We lay in the crawl space, pressed into the grime. The air was thick with the smell of old rust and dead rats. Above us, the floorboards creaked. I could hear the supervisor's chair scrape against the wood. I could hear the heavy breathing of the guard. He was standing right over us. If he looked down, if he kicked the rug, if he saw the corner of the panel, it was over. My heart was beating so hard I was sure it would vibrate the floor. I pressed my face into the dirt, biting my lip until I tasted copper to keep from screaming. The blueprint crunched against my chest with every shallow breath. I was lying on a bed of nails, and I had strapped a bomb to my body. "Nothing here." A voice grumbled above us. "Just wind blowing the papers." "Check the next room," another commanded. The boots receded. The door closed. The lock clicked. We didn't move for an hour. We lay in the dark, trembling. 2 rats in the walls of the giant machine. I realized then that Hans Schmidt, the factory worker, had died in that office. The man shivering in the dirt was something else. I had crossed the line. I carried the war in my shirt. We moved through the veins of the Krupp works. The maintenance tunnels were a nightmare labyrinth of steam pipes and high-voltage cables. It was hot, suffocatingly hot. The air tasted of sulfur and iron. We crawled on our bellies through spaces too small for a man, dragging ourselves over jagged rivets and slime-slicked steel. I used my knowledge of the factory like a weapon. I knew which pipes burned. I knew which fans would slice you to ribbons if you got too close. I navigated us by the heat, by the vibration of the heavy machinery thrumming through the walls. We emerged 3 miles away, near the canal discharge. We spilled out of a drainage grate into the cold night air, covered in black sludge, gasping like drowning men who had finally broken the surface. I reached into my shirt. The roll was still there, damp with sweat, bent but whole. We didn't speak. We couldn't. We just looked at each other, our eyes white and wide in faces masked with soot. We parted ways in the shadows of the coal heaps. Peter went east, toward the tenements. I went west. That walk home was the longest of my life. Every shadow was a Gestapo agent. Every car engine was a Black Maria coming to take me away. I burned the leaflets in my stove that night, watching the words of freedom turn to ash. But I couldn't burn the blueprint. I hid it inside the casing of my radio, behind the vacuum tubes. A secret wrapped in silence. The next morning, the factory was screaming. Sirens wailed continuously. The gates were locked. The Gestapo was everywhere. They tore the supervisor's office apart. They interrogated everyone. They knew something had been taken, but they didn't know who. I went to my station. I turned on my lathe. I machined a drive shaft for a truck. I worked with the precision of a master, while my insides churned like acid. I watched them drag men out of the assembly line. Men I knew. Men who had nothing to do with it. And that is the price. That is the bill that comes due. They didn't catch me. The tunnels had kept our secret, but the beast needed blood. If it couldn't find the thief, it would take what was available. 2 days later, they raided a warehouse in the northern district. It was another cell. Friends of friends. Good men. Boys, really. They found a radio. They found weapons. It wasn't related to the blueprint. Not really. But the theft had stirred the hive. The Gestapo was in a frenzy, striking at shadows. They hanged them from the cranes in the main yard. I had to walk past them to get to my machine. I had to look at their faces, swollen, purple, eyes staring at nothing. I knew one of them, Thomas. He had given me a cigarette once when I ran out. I stood there, gripping my toolbox, and I felt the weight of the blueprint in my radio back home. It was heavy, heavier than the dead men swinging in the wind. We got the plans out. A courier took them to Switzerland a week later. The Allies bombed the synthetic fuel plant before the roof was even on. The fuel never reached the east. The tanks stalled. The war ended a little sooner. But Thomas didn't see it. I am an old man now. The factory is gone, replaced by a shopping center. The smoke has cleared from the sky over Essen. I sit here in my chair, and the silence of the apartment is louder than the roar of the Krupp works ever was. I look at my hands. They are spotted with age, shaking with a tremor that has nothing to do with the cold. I hold a copy of that drawing. It was declassified years ago. Just paper, just line. People talk about resistance like it is a glorious thing. A trumpet blast, a charge into the light. It is not. It is a crawl through the sewer. It is a choice between 2 nightmares. I was a mechanic. My job was to make things work, to fit part A into part B and make the engine hum. A good mechanic seeks harmony, but to fight fascism, I had to become a breaker. I had to learn to destroy. And the hardest thing I ever had to break was not a machine. It was not a pipeline. It was my own innocence. It was the belief that I could keep my hands clean. I look at the blueprint, and I don't see a fuel plant. I see Thomas swinging from the crane. I see the price of the oil, the machine I worked on my whole life, the great engine of society. It is broken. I tried to fix it, but you cannot fix a machine that runs on blood. You can only wreck it. And when you wreck it, the shrapnel hits the people standing closest to you. The harvest of my life is ruined. The fields are salted with the choices I made. But I look at the calendar. I look at the date the war ended. And I know that because of that blueprint. The date is written in ink, not in blood that was yet to be spilled. Courage is not a shield. It does not protect you. Courage is a knife. You take it up and you cut the world. And you cut yourself. You bleed so that others might not. Tyranny does not arrive in a storm. It is built brick by brick. You must ask yourself not what you would die for, but what you are willing to risk everything for. That is where you will find your courage. This memory is a shard of glass I carry. Help me pull it out. Subscribe to keep this history alive.